All right, good morning and welcome everyone. We're so glad you're here with us today for Informed by Lived Experience, Recovery is Possible. We're recording today's session. I'm Carly Searcy, I'm Program Manager for ICU DDR. We are the International Consortium of Universities for Drug Demand Reduction. And we have three wonderful speakers with us today to discuss their work in recovery as well as to share their personal experiences in recovery. Our first speaker is Keith Navarozza. Keith is a person who has successfully maintained sobriety for nearly 9 years and is also internationally certified in addiction recovery coaching. His involvement in this field began in 2017, but he's been actively engaged in addiction work since 2014, collaborating with experts in the Philippines. He previously held the position of program director at Pines Recovery House, an addiction consultancy center in the Philippines, specializing in services like addiction consultancy, case management, and recovery coaching. Unfortunately, it had to close in 2020 due to the pandemic. Currently, Mr. Navarozza works remotely as a financial analyst for a US-based company. However, he continues his freelance work as a recovery coach and also dedicates his spare time to providing educational lectures on addiction and recovery in city jails and various treatment centers, particularly those with limited access to professional addiction services. In addition to his professional pursuits, he's pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Behavioral Science at the University of the Cordilleras, forgive my pronunciation, while taking care of his wife and 2 children. Keith, we are so glad you're with us. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I'm very glad and excited to be amongst presenters. And you know what? We have an amazing lineup of presenters here. I'm so amazed with you guys. And my apologies because I'm going to be reading most of the things that I'll be talking about today. It's much easier for me to do psychoed than to talk about my sharing a piece of me, and I usually have to put it in writing so I don't end up undersharing or oversharing or being all over. So here it goes. Today I'll talk about my lived experience with substance use disorder, how it was and how it is. And I began experimenting with drugs at the age of 13. The initial experience was driven by curiosity and a desire to fit in. However, the second time I used provided me with a sense of freedom from negative emotions I felt towards everyone and everything, including myself. To clarify, my family provided for my basic needs, but the pressure to conform to their expectations took a toll on my self esteem. Getting hooked was pretty quick. After about a year, I was obsessed, and about 2 years of using almost every day, my unmanageability became very obvious. And this brought me straight to the psychiatric ward and eventually to an addiction treatment facility at 16. Rehab was okay when I was young, but it was not sufficient. 6 months after completing treatment, I experienced a full blown relapse because I couldn't effectively deal with the numerous triggers I encountered both inside and outside of my home. While I did attend my support group meetings, I was focused on just trying to be a normal kid, despite being fully aware that I had a chronic brain disorder and that every type of feeling, whether it was good or bad, it was just always associated with me wanting to use. Over time, my parents went to the US, they divorced, and they remained there ever since and started their own families. Nevertheless, they provided us with a home, financial support that we needed, me and my sister. And however, this time I had the freedom of doing everything that I wanted without the fear of being picked up by people from the hospital or the psychiatric ward. So, moreover, I managed to reduce my meth use, and so I thought, by introducing other substances during college. I was pursuing a bachelor's degree in music production and was introduced to marijuana, alcohol, and subsequently other psychoactive substances, including different type of stimulants, opioids, hallucinogens, and depressants. In no time, I developed an intense fixation on every substance that I crossed path. I remember my first encounter with Valiums when I was in college. What started once a week became 10 tabs a day in a span of 2 months. The immense difficulty of withdrawal symptoms caused me to find other ways to get high, so I turned to drinking every day in an effort to steer away from illegal substances, particularly meth. Since my parents were no longer present to supervise my action, I frequently found myself entangled on a lot of legal complications due to my drug induced behavior. And believe it or not, there was even a time I got jailed twice in one day. I mean, who does that? Around 2003, I had a car crash involving two other vehicles on the freeway. The incident was a result of a cocktail of alcohol and depressants after school. While some may assume that this could mark the lowest point of my life, it was actually the initial chapter of a series of events that would eventually bring me to my true rock bottom. I eventually dropped out of school. I ventured a career in music where I did some occasional gigs, but my addiction caught up with me and I started missing studio time. And I was always wasted even before going up on stage. And we released the record, but eventually I got fired due to my excessive drug use. This time around, my mother in the US had to sell our house in the Philippines to cover my pending bills, attorney's fees, the loans she got to bail me out from my bind. And following these events, I just received less support from my family because I had a history of going in and out of jail. My family members, my relatives, distanced themselves because they knew that I was associated with bad people. So I started renting my own place. I tried to obtain various jobs, but my ability to hold on to employment rarely extended beyond 6 months. This was primarily because due to my recurring pattern of self-sabotage where I frequently failed to fulfill my obligation at work. And during this time, my mind was either I was consumed by the thought of taking in, finding a substance, actively engaging in finding ways to use, or just simply dealing with my withdrawal symptoms. So I was forced out of my apartment as a consequence of my conduct, and I found myself without any support from family and friends. Not even my drugging friends wanted to be with me. That's how bad it was. In summary, I found myself sleeping in the streets of Manila in the Philippines, and I resorted to begging for food, rummaging for scraps, but most of my time was just spent walking around attempting to gather loose change from the streets. Typically, I would collect around $1 a day, which often went towards purchasing gin. Gin in our country is around 60 cents. So I would use that to escape my circumstances. Occasionally, when I managed to accumulate more coins than the usual, I would either use them to obtain meth or go to a online casino. And it seems during that period, I had just lost hope and I came to accept the fact that that was my destiny. I was trapped in a cycle of getting and using and finding and ways and means to get more. 3 months have passed for walking the streets, and for some reason, I was resting in one sidewalk. I was broken, beaten, being sick and tired of being sick and tired. And the thought of asking for professional help crossed my mind. I didn't have a mobile phone, and I only had a SIM card. So I went to a security guard and then asked him if I could insert my SIM card to his phone and text someone important. So I did that, and then I just texted my mom out of the blue. I need I need professional help. That's what I told my mom, I remember. And then surprisingly, she called. She got in touch with my old program director from my old rehab. And after 15 years, I was back into treatment willingly this time. If you thought that was it was not actually. My path through treatment was far from straightforward. I went to several relapses during and after treatment, and at one point, I even found myself sleeping in the streets once again for a short while because I got kicked out. I got kicked out of the recovery house for breaking the rules. However, this time around, my relapses were followed by an instant regret and realization that this was not the way I wanted to live. The experience back to treatment gave me a glimpse that recovery was possible for someone like me. I never actually thought that it was possible for someone like me to go back into recovery. And so I did my legwork. I went back to my 12-step meetings. Instead of taking it one day at a time, I took it 1 hour at a time because it was a struggle for me not to use even for just one hour. After my 12-step meeting, when I get out, I was just thinking about how to use. So it was a struggle. So I would do it one hour at a time. I reconnected with my old treatment center peeps, support group, involved myself with their activities, and surrounded myself with people in recovery 24/7. Furthermore, I was very fortunate to have an exceptionally supportive program director at the treatment center. He not only provided me with the chances to volunteer within every recovery program he initiated, but he also pushed me to do lectures, co-facilitate in group sessions within the treatment center. And you know what was truly remarkable was his unwavering encouragement, motivation, and firm belief in my capability to accomplish tasks that appeared nearly impossible to me, considering my history of active addiction and numerous failed attempts to stay sober. He instilled in me the sense that I was genuinely valuable and deserving of success. So after 17 years, from the first time I went to treatment and the first time I got introduced to recovery, I finally achieved 1 year of sobriety. And I have not relapsed since then. So now, before we move forward, let me show you a couple of slides, Carly. Okay, so let's go to the first slide. There you go. Oh my, oh, so slide one, clearly the initial slide displays several images of my period of active addiction. Surprisingly, these are amongst the more tolerable pictures that I have. There are other pictures that I can't even bring myself to look at. In fact, I doubt the legality of those images. However, this was the reality of how it was, and there's no denying it. Next slide, please. So, slide number two. This slide showcases my early recovery phase, which was the second time I embarked on this recovery journey, the second time I got into treatment. These images illustrate various activities I engaged in during the initial stages of my recovery. And in addition to individual and group sessions, I immersed myself with activities that supported my path to recovery. I conducted teach back sessions at the treatment center and actively participated in recovery programs introduced by my program director. And moreover, I hosted a radio show for 2 years dedicated to discussion, addiction, and recovery. Now, you know what, surprisingly, um, there were instances in the radio show that I knew that no one was listening. So I would create text messages that pretend that someone would text, what is relapse? What is addiction? And I would answer them as if there was someone listening. I just needed to fill the entire hour with meaningful content. And that was something I was doing. I wanted to learn how to commit. And that was one of the earliest time, I think one of the first times I learned how to commit. And I did that for 2 years. So simultaneously, I also embarked on various training programs with the aspiration of eventually becoming an addiction professional. And next slide, please, slide number three. So jumping ahead 3 years, this eventually became a reality. I proceeded to undertake the credentialing examination and successfully passed both ICAP and RC. exams and became credentialed as an addiction professional and a recovery coach or recovery support specialist. Subsequently, I established my own modest addiction center with a primary focus in recovery coaching. And it's very important to emphasize that while I attained credentials, I was deeply committed to understanding when to assume this role and to recognize the ethical responsibilities it entailed, including acknowledging my limitations. Not a psychiatrist, psychologist, not a doctor, but I just had to make sure that I knew what hat to wear and to respect my limitations. Even after launching my center, I ensured that I stayed connected with my former program director by delivering weekly lectures at his facility. Next, slide 4. So this slide highlights several developments that occurred after I put up my center. I did not waste any time. In addition to my clients, I also began offering pro bono lectures and conducting small group sessions at nearby prisons, local government agencies, and other treatment centers that lacked the services of addiction professionals to assist their clients. I obtained accreditation as a service provider for the Bureau of Jail and Management and Penology in our region, where I provided psychoeducation for inmates that had drug cases. I created a program that helped reduce their sentences, even for just a few days, but it required them to attend my sessions, and I had pre and post exams. You make sure that they were listening, they understood, and I was doing that for almost 5 years. Even if it was repeated every 3 months, I knew there was a seed that was being planted. They knew the word. They knew the word relapse and all these things. So furthermore, I had the privilege of being selected to be part of a program initiated by our former vice president called Stories of Hope. This was a program, photo gallery, and the Commission of Human Rights, showcasing professionals in recovery who made significant contributions to the field of addiction and recovery in our country at a time when stigma was so strong because of a bloody drug war. Next slide. Lastly, the last slide presents my current situation. Regrettably, I had to close my center due to the impact of the pandemic and financial challenges. But fortunately, I was given the opportunity to work from home by a US based company. The income from this job allowed me to support my family, continue offering pro bono lectures, and concurrently pursue a degree in behavioral science. So, Carly, we can close the slides now. And in conclusion, I'd like to highlight two key points. First is, as a person in recovery, I've recognized the profound importance of hope in kickstarting and sustaining my healing journey. The sense of hope was instilled in me, and thanks to the guidance of my mentor and the individuals who accompanied me early on the path to recovery. They played a pivotal role, offering both direct encouragement and indirect influence. Equally crucial to my recovery was the support group I became a part of, which provided a safe and accepting environment where I could openly express my emotions without the fear of being invalidated. Second key point, as an addiction professional, I recognize the vital importance of acknowledging that em- not everyone who embarks on the same journey to recovery as I did. While I followed a specific program and support group, it's crucial to understand that not all individuals entering recovery will respond positively to the same approach. Therefore, it became a moral obligation to recognize and understand that there are multiple pathways to recovery and to guide individuals toward the one that best suits their needs. Furthermore, I hold a responsibility to both those around me and my profession. It was imperative that my actions towards my family, friends, colleagues remained consistent and aligned with my commitment to recovery. With my actions, I get to help people see and understand that abstaining from substance use constituted just 10% of the equation, whereas the remaining 90% involved addressing character defects, implementing recovery strategies, maintaining consistency in the actions necessary for me to sustain recovery. Understanding addiction also involves recognizing it is a complex and multifaceted condition that affects individuals psychologically, physically, and socially. This is why I always push for psychoeducation for everyone that might need it, whether a person is ready or not. When you connect to people while giving this lecture, you get an opportunity to plant a seed, and the seed can go a long way in helping them directly or indirectly. Do these activities exert excessive strain on my life? Not anymore. Despite the behavioral challenges I faced, which were either pre existing or as a result of drug use, the continuous commitment to making the right choices has now become second in nature. Today, I continue to strive to be a better person by making sure that my actions are at par with my recovery. Now, recovery isn't just about abstaining from psychoactive substances or addictive behaviors. Now it's about creating beautiful memories, me- maintaining a meaningful life, and passing it on. So, with that being said, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Carly, ICUDDR, for granting me the privilege to present today. I extend my special thanks to Verna for facilitating my connection with Carly, and to Junjun Abelia, my mentor, for being a steadfast pillar in my recovery. And lastly, I want to acknowledge my family for their unwavering love and support. And to all our professionals working in the field, always remember, recovery starts when you start to believe it's possible. My name is Keith. I'm an addiction professional and a recovering addict. I'm 8 years, 11 months, and 20 days clean and sober. Thank you so much, guys.
Keith, thank you. Thank you for choosing to share your story with us today, for being here. It was very meaningful. Our next speaker today is Roxanne Kibben, and we'll give a little introduction to Roxanne. She as project director at the Minnesota Center for Chemical and Mental Health at the University of Minnesota. Roxanne Kibben was a key player in establishing the Center of Excellence, fulfilling the Minnesota Department of Health's efforts to improve behavioral health practitioner competencies. In that role, she secured additional projects and partnerships to support sustainability. Roxanne has also worked as an addiction specialist and telehealth consultant for the R. Kibben Company and served as Project ECHO coordinator for Hennepin Healthcare. She currently serves as research implementation facilitator at Hennepin Healthcare Research Institute, where she's involved with the NIDA Clinical Trials Network Protocol, Exemplar Hospital Initiation Trial to Enhance Treatment Engagement, or EXIT, and Entree, with Dr. Gavin Bart and others across the country. She's been a sole proprietor and administrator, manager of for-profit and nonprofit organizations, served in various leadership roles in her national trade association, faith community, and recovery community. She's a former senior Fulbright scholar and president of NADAC, the Association for Addiction Professionals, and her interests focus on where technology intersects addiction service provision and service improvement. Her degree is in counseling, a master's in organizational management, and she is a licensed alcohol drug counselor. Thank you for being here, Roxanne.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you. Let me see, are you seeing my screen yet? Great. Okay. Oh, I tell you, I have had a amazing career, and my desire to share today has to do with how much I love to make a difference. I want my experience of transformation to fuel or at least fertilize another person's path on recovery, but without it being about me. I used to say that if I could help one little girl from losing her dad early to alcoholism, which is what I did, my life would be worthwhile. Well, I've done that a few times over, and I'm still not done. I, in fact, thought I'd retired a number of years ago. I'm not yet, but I do have a long career, and I just want to be clear, I'm not an active licensed alcohol drug counselor. So I want to help individuals, families, and organizations heal, teach others how to fish instead of giving them the fish. And when I was asked to do this, I talked about, lived experience is one thing, but the thing that I look back on is my long service in the field. I've been in recovery a number of years, since 1979, and I have been in the field of addiction services of one form or another since 1980. So I couldn't help but have this historic context of how I share about lived experience, in part because it's been a very significant part of my profession. I'm personally involved with my recovery. I'm very passionate. And I also, especially now towards my retirement, have gotten very creative. So you'll see different parts of my creativity perhaps show up in the various components of the PowerPoint. I think there's lots of benefits and there are risks to being a person in long-term or a person in recovery working in the field. So I want to talk about those and some safeguards that as we're educating the workforce of people working in drug dependence and rehabilitation, understand if they are in recovery, what they might need to be cautious of. And Keith, you did a great job. I just really, truly appreciate your recognition of, the ethics, the limitations or knowing your own limitations and your attention to recovery. So I think that's just part of what I'm going to highlight. And I think it's gone full circle. William White writes a lot about the history of addiction, and we'll touch a little bit on his stuff. This was a way for me to share with you a story that was my story from a while ago. This was done 10 years ago. I think you can perhaps see this. See if hopefully you can hear it too. It's just more concise than I would be.
It's outrageous. The impact on families and communities and society and medical costs. So I saw recovery as like a solution for so many of those problems that I felt like, what are we keeping this best kept secret for? I was 27 when I first got into recovery, and I happened to get into recovery because we had some concerns around my alcohol use and intervened because I was so grateful for a new life. I really wanted to give my life to the profession of addiction counselor. As the years have gone by, I've been a very outgoing person. I promoted the facilities I was a director for by telling my own personal story. I found it was so important is that people needed to share with their legislators and public officials their own story about what it was like to have an addiction, whether it was alcohol or drugs, and what it was like to find help. Recovery. We don't tell recovery. All people see is addiction.
So, that has some of the examples of how I, touched on my recovery in my roles as a treatment director or, various ways. And I think that does show that, there were times, that was contextual. That was in the 80s and the 90s. And so some of this has been really shifting in time. And I reflect on Bill White's history of addiction because he talks about a 50-year cycle. But when the field of addiction counseling was born, it was born out of kind of a mutual contempt. The providers, doctors, psychologists didn't know what to do with these alcoholics. They were difficult to deal with, and the alcoholics didn't trust the doctors and stuff. So out of that came this special success of the specialized knowledge of the wounded healer, and the people from the 12-step programs or the history back in the 18th century and the Washingtonians and the recovered persons being able to help make a difference. I think some of the risks of that self-disclosure and the bonding with the people that you're helping gets confused sometimes and complicated when you end up having it impacts your living, your recovery is so enmeshed with your living, your livelihood, that for me, integrating my recovery life with my work was just such a blessing. I couldn't believe it, but it wasn't, in fact, a risk. When I decided to become a counselor, I had to go through treatment the second time. I had to be 2 years sober, but I had to go through a full 4 weeks of treatment. And they evaluated whether I was suitable or not to get into the program based on was I doing my own work. Now, that was in some ways really beneficial because I had to do my own work and I was not doing it for counseling for the wrong reasons. But in the other way, it was really who would have an interview with a college today for a degree that was a 4 or 5 week residential, very intense therapeutic encounter, right? So I think one of the things is the benefit of lived experience is the stigma reduction. And, shame is so involved in this addiction, and the fear of judgment keeps people from getting help. To balance that self-centeredness of addiction, which is pretty pervasive in most of our paths of drinking and drugging. I mean, I had no idea how self-centered I was and how destructive I was. But, part of what I found in my path, and, I don't have a very unusual story of addiction. I started when I was 13. I sobered up when I was 27. But, I did the alcohol. I think the things that really brought me to my knees was, illicit drugs, especially cocaine, and injecting it, because I said I'd never do that. And then I went against my values and stealing from my own family, and, sexual promiscuity, and dropping out of school, all sorts of things that were not who I thought I was going to be. And so when it came time to want to become a counselor, I realized in the whole process of wanting to, oops, sorry, I just jumped between that, wanting to make a difference, as important as I share what my experience was, keep in mind is on top of the Minnesota model, which, as we look back, 45 years ago, addiction counselors weren't really seen as professionals at all. We were paraprofessionals. We didn't have a lot of role delineation or boundaries. And it was basically, you shared what worked for you, and, you learned some skills and things of that sort. I had a very good on-the-job training program I'll speak briefly about here. But I think one of the things that is important is to remember that it was a lot about self-disclosure, and oftentimes in an inappropriate way. The day that I went to treatment, well, the first full day in treatment, I went from South Dakota to Minnesota to a treatment center there. And I was sitting in the second row and at this lecture, and young woman, not much older than I was, maybe in her young 30s, got up in front of the room and started talking. And lo and behold, she shared that she used to shoot heroin. And it kind of stopped me. I can still remember that moment and that person and that visual, what? She doesn't look like a heroin addict. And it broke through a layer of defense and kind of that stereotypical image of what it was to be an addict. And I think that's part of what is so beneficial, is it made a difference to me in that seat, in that moment. I too was told I was going to be kicked out of treatment. I actually didn't, because they couldn't find a place to send me, but I'd broken the rules because the rules weren't for me. They were for everybody else. And I had really gone to treatment with the idea, well, I wonder if they can teach me how to drink in a sane way. How can I drink normally? Oh, those illegal drugs. Okay, maybe if I stay away from them. Anyway, I was, I was really clearly altered by somebody who did have a lived experience. Um, and as I pursued that calling to be a helping professional, part of what I really wanted is I wanted that lived experience to be authentic. And I wanted to share that hope with others. Keith talked about that. There's a lot of hope for a life that can be turned around. I thought I was going to die by the time I was 27 or 28. Little did I know I would be given a new life. But the lowering of those defenses or the barriers to help, I think, are made different from shared experience. And, the mutuality of the path also sets us up for the risk of over-identifying and losing or lowering our boundaries. Risks is that we disclose for the wrong reason, more out of a personal need rather than the client's benefit. There can be, lots of ways in which you think that you know it because you're doing it. You've proven you've got successful recovery, but the risk is that you know it all, and I began to neglect what I need to do for myself. And that complacency or slippage may lead to covering up and not being quite honest or clear about the boundaries, and can lead to relapse or impaired professionals. And I think the healthcare system, especially early recovery systems, were at risk of taking advantage of workers and overworking them. And sometimes it was people that went to treatment in the same place, worked in the same place, and then they would work extra hours, and then boundaries blurred and personal needs were met. Anyway, I'm going to go through some of this stuff a little bit faster. I got through my training program in the Minnesota model, started in Wilmer Hospital. Won't go too much into that, but that first Counselors Association here in 1960. But to go to my it was a work experience, a lived-in work experience. I lived on the state hospital grounds. This is northern Minnesota, one of 11 state hospitals. We had 340 beds for alcohol and drug addiction. And in order to get into the program, as I mentioned, I had to go through the residential treatment, but it was also the method of giving ongoing feedback was to use therapeutic qualities. That Jackie Small has a book called Naturally Therapeutic. So every 6 or 8 weeks, I was evaluated on how was my self-disclosure? Was I concrete in my confrontation? How was I genuinely warm with people and immediacy? So again, it gave me great feedback on how to become a good counselor, but it was also very personal. And they would establish whether I needed to go to more therapy or whether it needed to drop out of the program. And my first job, I touch on this one. There was a lack of licensure or certifications. I think in Minnesota, there was 2 or 3 certifications at the time, and I didn't know which one to do. And there were like 5 organizations. So it was this lack of clarity and unity. There was a disregard for personal boundaries. I'll tell you a story about that in just a moment. Ethics were poorly endorsed, limited self-policing. It worked for me, it should work for you. And we just got to tear down people before we build them up. So one of the things that I did, I think this is the last one, is excuse me, go to apply for a job, and it was a 5-day interview by participating in their family week. And that information that they gained in that family week was later used in performance reviews. So real lack of boundaries. I think, can you tell me how much time I have left? Excuse me. Is it about 3 minutes or 4 minutes?
Oh, you're good, Roxanne. 5 minutes is fine.
Okay. Pardon me. So I think that model of care really created a problem. Like my choking. Creates a problem. Just a moment. Let's see if I have a cough drop. I experienced a real sense of closure of the system in which I lived and worked. I surrounded myself with only people that I worked with in recovery and in the system of the treatment programs. And it ended up becoming a closed system. And I came across William White's early monograph from his PhD work on incest in the organizational family, a systems approach to staff burnout. And it was like a light bulb went off for me, because he talks about how, because we're people in recovery and so eager to be involved, make a difference, give back, so grateful, we'll overwork, we'll over identify, we'll get all our needs met at that treatment center or with the staff or with the sometimes with the clients too. That was more at risk with some of the early therapeutic communities. But the aspect of learning what it is to have role delineation, role supports, role boundaries. Pardon me. Help me to see that there's a way that not only an individual gets healthy and the family gets healthy, but the healthcare system or the program has a system of health or not as well. And sorry. So I started looking at what could I do to help organizations stay healthy. And I found his his early monograph is now the book about incestuous workplaces. And I'll resource that in just a moment. But I realized, that was at the time when we first had TAP 21 and the knowledge, skills, and abilities was published. And more around ethics and boundaries. And, unfortunately, because we didn't do enough self-policing in the all mental and chemical dependency counseling across the country, we had to make it illegal to have sex with your clients because there was not enough enforcement about it. We need a role of a profession is to police themselves and to have that code of conduct and to endorse it. So we've become, and I was very involved with that when I got involved with the Addiction Counselors Association. So sorry for my cough. But one has to pay attention. Oops, there's my time. Okay, let me see if I can wrap this up. One does have to pay attention to whether you're doing gain or harm. It's not just a matter of burnout. It's about managing and attending to one's wellness. And it's also about, as Keith mentioned, different models of care and harm reduction versus abstinence-based model. It's really an important growth opportunity for people who have had kind of an abstinence model focus. So we must challenge people to do that shift as well. And keeping in mind that self-disclosure, it's really now taught in a better way about what's how are you doing it. And we're coming around full circle to the paraprofessionals of the peer recovery support specialists and how can we support that, because it's a really important role, and it's a new role in how can have a common standard of skills, of education and certification and peer supervision, etc. So the risk of all of this is that later in my career, throughout my career, I found those systems that were less healthy than others and dysfunctional. I myself fell prey, even though I had the intellectual understanding. It was important to see how not only the field has suffered from, flipping through this, um, there are a number of stories. Any one of us that's been around for a while could tell you about someone close to them who had long-term recovery and they relapsed, but it was still kept secret, in part because of the stigma and shame we still have around addiction. And, you know, if we have cancer, we're much more likely to say, yes, I've had it, a new episode, a reoccurrence of it, and I'm cared for. But in this field, there still maintains a secrecy, especially for people in long-term recovery and the profession of keeping that secret. So I think we have more to learn and gain there. One of the most important visuals that I have gained in how to manage is to keep this replenishment network active. And it comes from his William White's book. It's if I can keep 3 professional non-work sports, so people that are outside of my career choice, but are also professionals, how can they be helpful to my well-being? My family supports, my non-work social supports, my professional work supports, my mentors, and then my activities. If I can do that, I can stay pretty well balanced. And as I wind down this talk and my career, what it comes down to for me is that people loved me enough to lead me into, accompany me, and spur me on throughout my diverse and adventurous career and recovery path. If I were to sum it up, it would come down to the essence of love. Pass it on, and thank you.
Roxanne, thank you for the gift of learning from your professional expertise, your personal experience, and this professional lived experience in the evolution of addiction counseling. There was a lot that you said that I wasn't aware of. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Michael Botticelli. I'll give a brief introduction and let him speak. Over the past 30 years, Michael Botticelli has held a variety of leadership positions at the local, state, and national levels. He was most recently the inaugural executive director of the Graykin Center for Addiction at Boston Medical Center and a distinguished policy scholar at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Prior to these positions, he was director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy for the Obama administration and the first person in recovery to hold this position. He was also the long-serving director of the Massachusetts Bureau of Addiction Services. He's also served in numerous leadership roles for the National Association of State Alcohol and Drug Abuse Directors. He was a member of the Advisory Committee for the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. He's authored many peer-reviewed articles that have significantly contributed to the field. And while mostly enjoying a leisurely life in retirement, Michael is currently consulting to the U.S. State Department, leading efforts to establish a global recovery network. Born and raised in upstate New York, maybe? Michael has a bachelor's degree. Thank you. Michael has a bachelor's degree from Siena College and a master's degree from St. Lawrence University. Michael, thank you for being with us today.
Great. Well, thank you, Carly, and thank you to Roxanne and Keith and for everybody to be on this call. I don't know how I left this off my bio, but oh, sorry about that. I had an incoming call and it seemed to have kicked me off the net. But as I was saying, I don't know how I left this off my bio, but you know, none of those things would have been possible had I not enjoyed a life in recovery. So I'm celebrating over 34 years in recovery at this point. So I thank you. And you know, I want to, and Carly, I don't have you on my screen, but if you could pop up my slides, that would be great. And I want to kind of pick up, and most of my talk today will really validate what Keith and Roxanne have already said, but I really want to kind of pick up on a theme that Roxanne talked about in terms of kind of the role of secrecy and stigma and how that continues to really profoundly affect all of our experience and all of our work, and why this idea of kind of personal stories in recovery and personal narrative are really critical if we really want to change how we have approached people with addiction. And particularly want to focus on kind of why science and data are really insufficient to change people's attitudes and people's opinions. I think, many of you work in academic circles, and I've known many people who have worked in this field who get profoundly frustrated by people's inability to use our scientific evidence and our data to support good public policy. And so kind of my premise here is that science and data are really insufficient to change public attitudes and to change our overall approach. So next slide, please. So really, I want to talk about again, use this premise that science and data are insufficient to change public policy, and we have, I think, lots of examples of that in our current, kind of currently in terms of think about climate change and all the data that we have yet, particularly here in the United States, we really have a large group of people who refute to think about it, or immunizations as a good example, kind of the debate and misinformation that we have around the efficacy of immunizations, greatest public health strategy we've ever had, but we still have lots of people who continue to refute the data. And I want to examine some strategies and circumstances that changed our understanding and approach. And changed might be a little overambitious, but of how we can use that to change it. And discuss how we might use these ways to move public health policy in an age of significant diminished scientific influence and extreme confirmation bias. And confirmation bias, we're all victims of confirmation bias. We all have a tendency to only accept data that conform to what we already know and refute data that doesn't conform to that. So I really want to kind of talk about how we do that. And I also think we have significant examples in other kind of social and medical arena where we've been able to do that, and why kind of knowing someone and personal narrative and stories actually probably do more to change people's opinions and attitudes than scientific information. So next slide, please. Probably not a surprise to anybody on this call, but if you look at the attitudes of addiction, and according to the World Health Organization, that drug use still ranks among the most stigmatized conditions that we have here, and alcohol use was fourth. So unless we really change people's attitudes about it, that we're going to really incur all of the profound impacts that these kinds of attitudes do. So, obviously addiction is a moral issue. These are bad people doing bad things, and hence our historic approach and solutions based on criminal justice approaches and not health approaches. Addiction as a choice. So people kind of willingly, people think that people are willingly choosing to be become addicted, and hence, kind of treatment is not important, because if they just stop doing it, and I'll talk about how our language sometimes can reinforce some of these attitudes. Roxanne talked about this has been largely ignored by the scientific and medical communities. And it really has only been maybe the past 50, 60 years where our scientific understanding of addiction has changed dramatically. And I would say, that we still have separate care and delivery systems from general health care, that we still haven't kind of integrated issues of addiction into our larger healthcare arena. So, and again, lots of studies show of attitudes among medical professionals still permeate their treatment of people with addiction. Addiction really is shaped by individuals' personal experience. So certainly, just about every family that I'm aware of has someone that they know who has an addiction problem, and that often can kind of shape, how people think about and approach people with addiction disorders. Media plays a powerful role in our lives in terms of how it shapes our understanding. My colleagues at Johns Hopkins did a study and did an analysis of how the media talks about particularly people with opioid use disorders, and found it was most often in a punishment or criminal justice context, not in a health context. And that our language really plays a critical role here in terms of how we think about and our attitudes about people with addiction. And as Roxanne talked about, many people in recovery have been historically anonymous. And I think, it's been this kind of confusion about our anonymity in terms of our membership in a 12-step program versus our anonymity in the general circumstances. And that was certainly the case with me. So next slide, Carly. So the manifestations are profound. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but we know that there's lots of personal or self-stigma that leads to kind of care avoidance or delaying in seeking care for both individuals and families. And this was certainly the extent for me. Nearing the end of my alcohol and drug use, like I clearly knew that I needed help. But I was really afraid to seek help. I was afraid what my family was going to think. I was afraid what my employer was going to think. I couldn't fathom a life without alcohol and drug use. This kind of concept of a life in recovery that the previous speakers spoke so beautifully about was just not visible to me. And I think that's, clearly why, Recovery Month and people in recovery and recovery activities are so critical to the work that we do. Roxanne talked about, kind of stigma manifests itself at the clinical level. And we still have stories today about how people who intersect with the medical community are mistreated, are judged, are not getting any care or getting subpar clinical care. And again, polls and surveys of even clinician attitudes show significant stigma among medical clinicians, particularly here in the United States, in terms of how they view people with addiction. And certainly areas that I worked in the public policy arena, right? So long history of discrimination and discriminatory practices with our insurance companies. I remember when I was with the Obama administration, we did an analysis of laws and policies that contribute to a barrier of people in recovery. And there were like 50 laws and policies where people either couldn't get student loans, couldn't get housing, where criminal records impeded their ability to return to kind of a meaningful and purpose-filled life that the previous speakers talked about. And certainly it has led to a criminalized focus in terms of how we approach addiction, that these are bad people, so we need to criminalize their behavior and punish them as a means to solve their addiction issues. So next slide, please. So this is a little bit dated study, but the data I think still hold today. These were done by some of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins, who did a survey on people, on public attitudes of people with addiction, and compared it to even people with mental health. And they found out that 43 opposed giving health benefits to people for drug addiction versus 21% for mental health, that employers should deny employment. These are all very relevant things that we see today in terms of people's ability to get care and enter recovery. Even though we know that housing is critically important for people's ongoing recovery, that many landlords said that they should deny housing. And only 30% believe that recovery is possible for both illnesses, right? So again, this lack of a visible recovery community, I think, just reinforces this perception on people's minds that this is not a treatable condition and that recovery is possible. So next slide, please. So how do we change the conversation, right? How do we change public attitudes. If you believe, as I do, that unless we change public attitudes, we're not going to make major improvements in terms of instilling hope and recovery for folks by giving them kind of good care and good recovery supports. So what we know, and again, numerous studies show this, that personal narrative matters, that knowing someone dramatically affects your perception and attitude, and that emotion appears to change people's attitudes more than science and data, right? So, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't use science and data, but I think kind of pairing that with personal narrative really kind of reinforces the work that we do. You know, you know, often recall, you know, kind of trying to kind of change people's minds or, you know, put forward good legislation or good public policy. And, you know, often kind of would get frustrated of why people wouldn't rely on kind of science and data to be able to do that. But combining with personal narrative really makes a difference in that. The role of allies and unexpected messengers around this are critically important to our work. So it's not only our own personal stories, but it's also those of some of our allies. And particularly those in law enforcement can be really powerful spokespeople for what we want to accomplish. You know, one of the things that we used to do when I was with the Obama administration, I would travel the country and we would have these town hall meetings. And we strategically would find a law enforcement professional, a sheriff, who basically said that arrest and incarceration were not the solution, but that more treatment and recovery was important. And, you know, sometimes I felt like if I was doing my job most effectively, that I didn't have to say anything, that it was all of those allies who were kind of reinforcing what we were trying to accomplish was important. And I think, you know, particularly in policy circles, law enforcement and those in the criminal justice arena really can hold a significant amount of sway in terms of people's attitudes and approach. So how we work and cultivate people in law enforcement is particularly important. Media coverage is another good way to begin to change the narrative around this. I don't know if they're still doing it, but NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, would periodically hold boot camps for reporters in how to appropriately cover stories of addiction to ensure that they were stigma-free, that they were evidence-based, and they were not continuing to contribute to this trope of addiction as a moral issue or as a criminal justice issue. I think we've seen the tremendous role that parent and people in recovery and recovery advocacy can play in changing people's minds. You know, having a visible recovery community shows that treatment's effective, that recovery is possible. You know, Keith, you know, eloquently talked about the role that hope plays in people's lives, and that's certainly true for me. Of, you know, when you're feeling hopeless, being able to see people who, with the help of others and with the help of treatment, have been able to turn their lives around and having meaningful, purpose-filled lives, I think is particularly important. And, you know, saw the profound role that parents and people in recovery can play. Certainly, criminal justice reform has a huge role to play in kind of changing the conversation. I think that we've seen in other countries and here in the United States and some beginnings of people beginning to experiment with criminal justice reform to move addiction out of the punishment arena and into the health arena. Changing the language of addiction. This is particularly important to me that, you know, we are still, and when I say we, I mean big we, you know, the media, our general conversation, and even people in recovery continue to use stigmatizing language. And we know that has a direct effect on how people are treated. So continuing to use words like addict, junkie. A colleague of mine, many of you might know, Dr. John Kelly, who runs the Recovery Research Institute at Massachusetts General Hospital, did this really interesting study where he gave trained mental health clinicians two nearly identical scenarios of how of someone with an addictive disorder. And in one, he talked about the person as a substance abuser, and in the second, change that to a person with a substance use disorder. And what he found, even among trained professionals, when you called someone an abuser, it was much more likely to elicit a punitive response versus a therapeutic response. Roxanne talked about some of the risks, and I, as a person in recovery, have been faulted sometimes because I will use my 12-step language in public arena. And I think those of us in recovery have to be very, very cautious about the language that we use with each other versus the language that we use in public arenas. So, I think, for all of us, if we are hosting events or there's lots of dictionaries out there that we should be making sure that people are using clinically appropriate, non-stigmatizing language. And the last bullet there, I just got that was from a previous presentation. I forgot to, but I think part of what we tried to do in the Obama administration is really kind of return to much more of a science and evidence-based approach in terms of how we were dealing with this. We certainly have a long way to go in terms of the work that we're doing. I am kind of heartened by the progress that I've seen during kind of my career in terms of a change in attitude, change in discussion, but still understand that we have a long way to go in terms of really dealing with substance use issues as a health condition and not as a criminal justice issue. So I'm really honored to be part of this. Really want to thank Carly and our other speakers for, I think, just kind of showing kind of the power and the restorative power of kind of stories and narrative play in terms of our ongoing journey. So thank you.
Michael, thank you. Something that you don't know about me is that I started my career as a librarian. And so when you talk about stories as a way to get to meaningful systems change, you were just making my heart happy. I wrote down personal narrative matters. So I'm going to add that to my, toolkit of thinking about these issues. So thank you. Thank you to all three of our speakers for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience. I'm grateful to you for making today's event possible, relevant, meaningful. I will put in our chat my email address in case anyone who is on the call today is interested in joining ICU, DDR, or ISEP, and we'll get you some more information about that. But what I want to do with the remainder of our time today is to unmute our participants so that they can ask questions if they would like. That'll take me just a minute. For those of you on the call, you're just going to get a message that says you've been requested to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. You're also welcome to type those in the chat, and I'll watch for those and read them out loud. So I think I got everyone the opportunity to unmute and ask a question, but if I didn't, just type that in the chat as well. We did record today's session, and so I think this was really powerful, and I definitely want to expand the audience. So I'll be emailing all the folks who signed up who weren't able to be here with the recording, but we're also going to think about some creative ways to share it with our larger audience. Do we have any questions from folks who are here with us?
I don't have a question, but I would like to comment and again thank everybody. I think it was a very just a unique synergistic approach to peer recovery, a former addiction counselor, somewhat educator, etc., and policymaker, all talking about lived experience, but also from different perspectives. And I just like to take up the imagination of our future, such that anyone with substance use disorder walks into their primary care clinic, their doctor or emergency room, and gets the same kind of care that anybody with high blood pressure or a heart attack. If you go into a hospital with a heart attack, you don't have to see a cardiologist to get cared for. You are given medication, you're told what kind of behavior changes to make. You are supported and given other resources, and that happens across the board. Imagine if someone with opioid use disorder walks in and any hospital, any doctor, or any provider could in fact give them the right medication that we know works. And they don't even, they don't even have to have the special training in it now. It used to be that was a barrier for in our country for doctors prescribing a medication for opioid use disorder. So just imagine the fact that we have common knowledge about how to treat and address substance use disorders. I mean, it's a game changer, but that's an indication of how the role of stigma is so impactful. And also, I can imagine the criminal justice system too, if we could address the criminalization of all this, and also, there's so many people that the social construct of what we've done with marginalized people that sets them up for.
Yeah. I want to pick up, Roxanne kind of reminded me of something that I actually wrote down and didn't talk about as kind of changing, conversation changers, right? And one is legal action, right? So I think, we have long histories here of discrimination and mistreatment. And I think we're seeing the use of legal action to diminish some of that. So whether that is going after insurance companies for still having separate treatment, whether that's going to our jails and prisons for suing people for anti-discrimination laws and not providing good evidence-based care for people. So, while we're talking about kind of advocacy, like part of that advocacy is really looking at kind of legal levers that we might have here and around the world to leverage that kind of change. And I think we're seeing that more and more as a viable tool to ensure that people are getting appropriate and meaningful care.
Thank you. All right. Well, we've got a quiet audience with us today, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up as you three all have other important things that you need to do today. Thank you again for the gift of your time. This was really a wonderful experience.
Great.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Night.
Good night, Keith.